Okay, so as you'd all know, technology has long been a tool to support management. However, a range of automated systems represent a fundamental shift in the scale and capability of complex management practices that once required human decision-making. So in this talk, I refer to automation and artificial intelligence as it relates to work and employment as the convergence of a broad range of interrelated technologies and methods, which include things like monitoring software, tracking devices, sophisticated algorithms, machine learning, natural language processing, speech recognition, computer vision, robotics, and automated reasoning for decision making. But for simplicity in this talk, I often refer just to AI as an overarching term. AI more broadly is one of a closely related and overlapping general purpose technologies, which might also include things like DNA sequencing, blockchain, and battery storage. And at the intersection of all of these major new technologies are a host of applications such as 3D printing and autonomous mobility. Here, however, I'll confine my summary to technologies as they relate to work and employment. So in terms of a framework for the discussion today, I'll talk about 4 dimensions of work and employment where digital management is either established or emergent, or is already having or is likely to have a significant impact. And these dimensions are around recruitment and selection, the allocation of tasks, tracking and evaluating productivity, and more broadly, automation jobs and labour markets. So in relation to each of those 4 areas, I'll discuss what we know from peer-reviewed studies, but also grey literature, including reports and media citations, and also legal cases, because that's where we often see the tensions are most evident in relation to technology and work. And I'll also include some material about how technology has been impacted by the global pandemic. And I'll talk about each of these things in relation to the trends that are occurring and the types and capacities of technologies being deployed, and then also the impacts of those technologies. And in some of these overlapping themes, there's a relatively decent volume of extant literature, and in others, our knowledge remains highly nascent. So one significant dimension of the broad transformations in the digital management of work has been in the recruitment and selection of staff. So until the mid to late 90s, recruiting new employees was primarily a people-driven process. And then from the years from 2010 to 2015 saw the emergence of AI-enabled tools. And this really fundamentally changed candidate recruitment and selection. And today, AI-enabled recruitment systems represent a very substantial value proposition to organisations. So they offer a cost-effective means to attract a large and diverse group of qualified job candidates, and agility in responding to changes in the labour market, and the ability to free up resources for other human resource activities. And it's unsurprising, therefore, that the use of AI in recruitment systems appears to be shifting quite quickly from the periphery to centre stage. Black and Van Esch outline how AI tools are deployed across 4 phases of the recruitment process: outreach, screening, assessment, and coordination. So in outreach, AI tools such as Textio learn presentation methods such as banner ads, email, and text, which optimize the wording of job ads to generate higher quality and more diverse applicant pools. And that's of both active and passive job candidates. AI can also screen candidates, improving the efficiency of recruitment by reducing time to hire and providing a strategic advantage when competing for talent. And that's especially the case in high turnover industries. So some US developers claim that their software speeds up the hiring process by up to 90%. Applicant tracking software such as Arctic Shores can now automatically generate psychometric profiles about an applicant's job, skill, and organisational fit. And there's some evidence that machine learning systems can perform better at identifying the best applicants than human HR managers can. And that candidates can benefit from increased awareness of vacancies, reduced delays in hearing whether they've been shortlisted, and potentially, although there's some issues there which I'll go into, reduced bias in decision making. Assessing candidates can also be automated via verbal computer-mediated communication and web-based interviews which score candidates on language, tone, and facial expressions. And companies such as Highview and VCV, which use speech interpretation and visual gesture analysis, can screen job candidates for qualities like grit, track how often they smile, and analyse how a person's face moves to determine, for example, how excited they are about certain job tasks or how they might behave around an angry customer. And chatbot software such as Maya and Wendy use neural language models to interact with candidates. And then systems such as Express and Manitel automate time-consuming tasks such as candidate screening and assessment. And then finally, in the coordination phase of recruitment, AI chatbots such as Nuance can engage with candidates in real time, answer questions or ask for missing information. They can automatically schedule interviews and notify candidates of their progress. Although natural language understanding remains an unsolved problem, chatbots can now give a reasonable impression of being able to understand a human dialogue. AI-enabled recruitment has potentially profound economic and social impacts, given that it can help determine who gets a job and who doesn't. So principles of validity, reliability, and freedom from bias have obviously long been central to the study of recruitment processes, but AI-enabled recruitment systems introduce a range of new opportunities, but also challenges for objective and fair hiring decisions. And the challenges include, firstly, transparency. So most systems operate in the absence of any kind of specific requirements to disclose how they're used for candidate selection and ranking and hiring. And companies and governments and NGOs and academics have dedicated substantial efforts to address this ethical problem. And they've generated a range of AI ethics principles and statements, but these principles usually don't say much about how accountability should work in practice. Another challenge that we see is validity. So affect recognition technology claims sometimes to read inner emotions during selection interviews, and this has been particularly contentious, especially in light of conflicting research which suggests that detecting emotions with high accuracy requires a context beyond the face and the body. The validity of the recruitment process may also be threatened if candidates can game, disrupt, or manipulate their responses to the automated system. AI-enabled recruitment also results in uneven risks and benefits to job candidates. Job seekers with, for example, limited digital skills or access to technology, so possibly people who are older or who have a disability or who live in remote areas, which is a particular issue in Australia, may be negatively impacted by the automation of recruitment. And finally, there's the issue of bias and discrimination, and this has been receiving increased attention. So a recurrent justification for algorithmic management practices is that it can eliminate the individual bias of recruiters in managing the workforce because the systems apparently apply objective and neutral criteria. However, some studies and a succession of media reports have challenged this claim. So an example of bias in job advertising is where the job ad itself is neutral in how it describes a role or the qualifications that are required for the role. But if the ad targets only people who satisfy particular criteria, it could breach discrimination regulation. So AI is programmed to recognise patterns and identify, but also ignore certain defined attributes. And if those characteristics are either not sufficiently diverse, or if subpopulations are not well represented, then the underlying algorithm may replicate existing social and labour market inequalities. And this is often known as the dirty data problem. Labour derived via digital platforms is what we might say is the quintessential example of algorithmic control over the allocation of jobs and tasks. Many of the best known matching algorithms are at base a type of optimisation that assigns tasks whilst minimising some economically relevant variable. So, for example, the Uber algorithm minimises the time taken for a driver to reach a customer or a passenger whilst maximising the overall number of rides. An ACAS report documents growing evidence that some of the digital management practices pioneered in the gig economy are starting to spread to the wider labour force. So algorithms are being used to implement just-in-time work practices, which involve offering workers shifts or contract work according to the expected business demand. Increasingly common in retail and hospitality, automated shift allocation algorithms include sophisticated machine learning, which forecast customer footfall, and they take into account anything from traffic history to point of sale data and even weather forecasts. And low-wage workers are disproportionately subject to these automated scheduling systems, which predict how much labour will be required and to maintain staffing at a minimum level. In the gig economy, workers are said to be bound to platform tasks via the use of reputation rating mechanisms, which many of you will be familiar with, that use workers and contractors' ratings as criterion for success. And these algorithms also restrict and control tasks and the nature of work. But beyond the gig economy too, such as in restaurants, individual waiters can be rated by patrons or their employers via an app. And it's been reported that some questions ask about factors over which wait staff don't necessarily have any control, such as the quality of the food or the condition of the restaurant. A broader impact of the automated allocation of tasks on digital platforms is that they can fundamentally reshape the organisation of work in a given occupation or profession. For example, in a study my colleagues and I undertook a couple of years ago about the use of platforms by photographers, we showed how 3 core functions of photography platforms influenced creative work in particular. And so they were pricing and receipt of payment, the product quality and service, and the establishment and management of client relationships. So, for example, booking and stock image platforms in photography, so by selling photo shoots or images for a set price, assign value to creative production, and in the process intervene in the negotiation of value that traditionally occurs between an artist and a buyer. So the photograph is effectively unbundled from the artistic process, and it becomes a commodity that is produced solely for its exchange value, with little or no value being assigned to the photographer's time, labour and creativity. Shift allocation algorithms, so this is in terms of the impacts, shift allocation algorithms can benefit workers by giving them clearer advance notice of when shifts will be and making it easier for them to swap and change them. And this may avoid, in retail and hospitality, for example, workers having to be ready to turn up to shifts only to find them cancelled or cut short with little notice. However, scheduling algorithms can also result in shortened shifts and also illogical schedules that are unresponsive to workers and sometimes even managers' needs. And in this instance, refractive surveillance is at work, wherein the surveillance is aimed at consumers, but the impact is at work, but the impact is actually on the workers. And a study by Williams in 2018 on retail workers found that algorithms aimed at fostering business efficiency can lead to suboptimal results as a consequence of the algorithm having a very narrow notion of efficiency, which basically doesn't take into account that there are many hidden costs associated with schedule instability, and nor the pressure that this instability places on workers. The history of worker surveillance is linked to the history of capitalism itself, in the sense that surveillance enables managers to extract more labour from workers. And algorithmic management systems greatly enhance the employer's capacities to direct and evaluate and discipline employees way beyond what could be accomplished through other less invasive forms of control. Surveillance has become increasingly ingrained in many workplaces. In the US, it's been estimated that 7% of employers use video surveillance to track job performance and 8% to track company vehicles. But this is, these figures are considerably lower than the number of companies which monitor employees' email, computer keystrokes, and computer files, which is around 45%. Worker surveillance has become so extensive that employers can access a live feed of granular behavioural information about workers across a whole range of workplace settings, such as factories, in offices, obviously, and even in home care. The workplace monitoring software industry is predicted to reach $3.84 billion by 2023. And technologies have been developed to address so-called cyber loafing, and that's the propensity of employees to use email and the internet for personal use while at work. And they often require the installation of remote control software on employees' computers and a monitored connection to corporate VPNs. And as I'm sure you'd be aware, the COVID-19 pandemic has ushered in a golden age of surveillance and renewed techno-optimism. So in the name of an emergency authorization mindset of a global health crisis, we've seen many commercial and government institutions increasing the scope and scale of data-driven surveillance infrastructure. A significant trend driving this increased worker surveillance since the pandemic began is around teleworking. An EU 27 survey reported that 46% of all teleworkers had no previous experience of remote working. And what they referred to as teleworkability is highest in, as you would expect, financial service and ICT, and lowest in manufacturing and construction. In terms of the types and capacities of technologies around worker surveillance, these systems collect data about worker activities through a whole range of means, including handheld devices, point of sale systems, mobile phones, fingerprint scanners, fitness and wellness apps, GPS trackers, smart cameras, microphones, webcams, body sensors, and tools that scan emails and texts. And these tools serve a multitude of purposes for employers, which includes tracking application usage and web history, assessing productivity, identifying the most innovative and influential workers, detecting deviant behaviour and other risks, and reporting business intelligence, data analysis. And a growing number of firms have begun using facial recognition software to analyse employees' concentration and mood, while others use applications that assess whether certain documents and messages have been read, and they can take photos with the computer's camera to ensure the employee is physically present. Within a matter of weeks at the start of the pandemic in the US, sales of the Sneak, SNEEK, online surveillance software increased tenfold, and the software product score saw interest from prospective customers rise by 600%. Data-centric technologies often deployed in the name of safety come in the form of fitness apps, safety belts, and even mattress sensors to track sleep. These devices are sometimes offered to workers as part of health and wellness programs. And during COVID-19, there's been an explosion of new apps and wearable devices that can track really quite highly sensitive data, such as employees' health information and physical location. And they do this in order to assess compliance with social distancing and hygiene goals. For example, Ford has developed a watch that can be worn by workers to help them keep a distance of 2 meters between them. The employers deploying biometric systems most prolifically tend to be concentrated in low-wage, hourly work industries such as construction, hospitality, retail, agriculture, and logistics. And these contexts are more susceptible to datification because tasks are more easily measured. The impacts of surveillance that track and evaluate employee productivity are many. They include technologically driven speed ups, and Amazon has been leading the pack here by the implementation of a video game called Mission Racer that makes workers compete against one another to fulfill orders. And it's been noted that making work into a race contrasts with standard and accepted principles of engineering, and this might explain why the injury rate for warehouse workers is twice as high as other private industries. In theory, wearable tech could actually help improve worker health and safety. However, surveillance technologies rely on shaping employee behaviour in a way that minimises workplace hazards. So it effectively shifts accountability from employers to workers. The development and use of biotech for safety has also been quite uneven across occupational groups. So, for example, sweat vests introduced by the NFL captures perspiration, which is one indicator of exertion. And we've seen the body statistics of individual NFL players become somewhat of a commodity. It's by making its way into video games and endorsements and sports gambling. But by contrast, migrant farm labourers who routinely work in extreme heat might actually benefit from sweat vests, but instead they often fight an uphill battle to get even basic accommodations around heat stress and stroke. There are also growing concerns that surveillance can chill efforts by workers to exercise their protected rights to engage in collective action or to take actions to change workplace conditions. For example, Amazon-owned grocery retailer Whole Foods uses data about the location of nearby unions and union membership size and poverty and unemployment levels in a particular geographic region to create a kind of heat map to track potential unionisation at its stores. The use of biometric systems have also raised the issue of privacy. A concern is that the information collected is often combined with third-party data sources and remains unregulated. Monitoring also blurs the line between work and home, and in extreme cases invites an employer's surveillance tech literally into bed with a monitored worker. A full bench of the Australian Fair Work Commission recently upheld the dismissal of a factory hand who refused his employer's fingerprint scanning technology that monitored attendance and tracked shifts. The decision was made on the basis that it would be impractical to allow one employee to be exempt from this technology when all other employees had agreed to do so. And there have been at least 8 similar US lawsuits involving objections to fingerprint and hand scanners, and additional similar cases involving biometric facial recognition software and health or temperature screening devices. So in addition to objections which are based on privacy, there may also be data limitations in biometric systems. So Anderson in 2020, for example, found that the elderly and manual workers often had damaged or abraded fingerprints, and that people with dark eyes and large pupils have difficulty using iris recognition systems. A person's race can also influence facial recognition, how facial recognition software interprets facial expressions. Transparency has also been raised as a further issue. So surveillance is often hidden and multifaceted and continuous. According to the US retail worker advocacy organisation United for Respect, Walmart managers have asked workers to download an app onto their personal devices that check inventory and where stock has been misplaced on shelves. The managers reputedly didn't tell the workers that the app requires access to cameras and location services on their phone in order to function, and that it's constantly on unless workers deliberately turn it off. Another aspect of transparency is that workers may find it difficult to challenge algorithmically derived employment decisions like discipline or firing. An example of this in retail is where cashiers are scored on their performance by monitoring technologies that are built into their registers or handheld devices. And then at the end of the shift, the workers get an aggregate performance score, but at the same time, they're unlikely to know how the score was determined or what they might be able to do to improve their metrics. Legal cases have also illustrated the particularly contentious nature of outsourcing data collection and decision-making to make employment decisions. In these cases, neither the employee nor even the employer are permitted to know how the algorithms work. There was a case, for example, in a Texas district court which involved the use of privately developed algorithms which were used to terminate public school teachers for ineffective performance. The plaintiff, which was a teachers' union, sought an injunction against the use of this algorithm in termination or non-renewal of contract decisions. The employer, which was the school district, had delegated teacher evaluation to a third-party vendor, and it didn't verify or audit the scores, and it conceded in the court case that there was actually no means by which teachers themselves could do so either. So the result of that case was that the parties reached an out-of-court settlement where the school district undertook to cease using the evaluation system as a basis to terminate employment. Policy debates about constant surveillance and unfettered data collection have primarily focused on consumers rather than workers, unfortunately. The law, in fact, provides few boundaries on employer surveillance. Generally, cameras are prohibited in intimate settings such as bathrooms. And in the US, some states have enacted legislation where employers aren't allowed to require employees to have a tracking microchip implanted in their bodies. But really beyond these quite narrow limitations, employers generally have the power to condition employment on workers' consent to a variety of monitoring practices. So here I want to discuss several types of automation that are being increasingly deployed across workplaces, and their demonstrated impacts on jobs and workplace relations and the labour market more broadly. So as we know, a prominent form of automation is robotics. The agricultural sector is using what's known as effector robots to automate activities like meat carcass processing, milking and fruit handling. Although most current manipulation robots are purpose-built for a particular set of tasks, research is ongoing into building what's known as domain general manipulation robots. And this is where their physical design allows them to perform an open-ended array of tasks in an industrial workplace or even around the home. Other types of automation include decision systems, which actually make the decisions based on a collection of relevant evidence without the need for any human intervention. And then there's sort of aligned with that decision support systems, which provide advice to a human decision maker. And these technologies are really gaining momentum. So in the criminal justice system, they can predict recidivism, inform bail and parole decisions, and deploy police patrols. In social care, decision systems can make predictions about risks for families and children, and in accident compensation about applicants' treatment in relatively simple cases at the moment. Decision systems are also in widespread use to buy and sell shares in high-frequency trading and in economic forecasting and risk management. They're operational in the logistics industry to plan routes for freight vehicles, and in the insurance industry to identify claims that merit special attention. In medicine, these decision systems are used to classify medical images and make medical diagnoses. And in agriculture, they advise farmers about when and how to irrigate or fertilise. Chatbots have also been discussed in relation to their impacts on jobs. Chatbots such as Ask HR and Lexi are used in HRM, for example, to guide employees through various administrative tasks to do with payroll or leave booking. They're also widely used in online call centres to answer customer inquiries and complaints, and they're used in sales and marketing contexts in the sense that they can augment websites and play the role of a salesperson. A final example is text generation systems, which are now being used to write weather forecasts and reports for the stock market and sports events. They can also create the text of web pages. A UK company, Radar AI, for example, specialises in generation systems that produce local news. So in terms of the impact on jobs, and you'll be aware that often in discussions of AI and employment and referring to previous industrial revolutions, the point is often made that AI technologies will create new jobs as well as eliminating some old ones. In general, I think it's increasingly accepted that the likelihood of large-scale technological unemployment is quite low. However, there's also an emerging agreement that the impacts on jobs is by no means negligible. And this can include de-skilling jobs, displacing jobs, or tasks within those jobs. Forecasts also include, on the positive side, liberating humans from work that is either heavy or hazardous or repetitive. The study of the effects of automated systems on jobs has resulted in a wide variety of predictions. So these predictions about new jobs include highly technical roles that develop and deploy AI systems, and jobs that involve testing and overseeing AI. And where new jobs are created, the question still remains about how many will be of high value and how many will be receive a decent amount of pay. Other new roles could include content authoring and data training required in the construction of chatbots and text generation systems. However, the point of these jobs is that once the human work is done, that same work is thereafter carried out by the system that's been built through that work. And Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform is the quintessential and one of the largest contractors for human services in training data. There's also the potential for automated decisions to de-skill jobs by allowing decisions to be made by staff with less experience. So in some banks, for example, decision systems that deal with creditworthiness are now made by staff with less expertise than they had in the past. And we know that humans who are rarely called upon to use certain skills either lose the confidence or the competence to offer meaningful oversights of algorithmic outputs. Fully autonomous decision systems can also displace jobs altogether. For example, fewer CCTV surveillance jobs are required when certain types of events can be accurately identified. And chatbots can take on the more routine aspects of a client interaction before handing over to a human. So if we talk about the impacts on labour markets, much like the introduction of other general purpose technologies throughout history, such as the internal combustion engine, electricity, computers, the internet, etc., automated systems, including AI, are expected to be beneficial in the longer term in relation to growth and standards of living. However, in the nearer term, financial challenges are likely to encourage innovations that decrease labour costs. Gavagan and colleagues in a substantial report published this year explain two possible outcomes of this scenario. The first is that citizens have much less income, and the second is that they have much less work. And they argue that both of these can be experienced at the same time, but they're not necessarily connected. So if AI is genuinely labour saving, we could have similar levels of income but less work to do. But if the profits of the AI revolution are captured by only a small proportion of the population, many of us might find that we have to work harder just to keep our current levels of income. A Royal Bank of Canada report concluded that the important skills for the great majority of workers in the future will be those that are fit for tasks to which AI is poorly suited. And these include active listening, speaking, critical thinking, reading comprehension, and social perceptiveness. However, advances in affective computing are already making AI much more effective at a range of face-to-face competencies that we currently think of as distinctly human skills. So overall, if history is any guide, the projected efficiency gains from automation are likely to outweigh any argument for protectionism towards human workers who are threatened by technological redundancy. Whether or not this should be the case, of course, is an open question. So just in conclusion, scholars and regulators and labour representatives have suggested various forms of protections for workers from the proliferation of automated management strategies. And these fall broadly into three areas: privacy, transparency, and advocacy. First, privacy. Workplace surveillance has become all-encompassing because employers have very few legal limits on their rights to surveil, and workers have very few privacy rights, as I explained. Privacy advocates caution that the tools we create today may end up in a kind of surveillance inertia that will shape data collection and storage practices for many years to come. The concern is that employers can hoard data that may follow workers even after they've left a job. In fact, the perpetual surveillance and optimisation of worker performance seems to be the direction in which the future of work is headed. This makes employers one of the largest collectors of data and one with nearly unchecked authority. Jerry Kang suggests that we consider privacy interests through 3 clusters: spatial, decisional, and informational. There are generally protections in most jurisdictions around spatial and decisional privacy, such as, for example, laws that protect people from having their home invaded. But informational privacy is argued to need a lot more protection around it. The second area argued to warrant attention is in transparency, particularly around AI-enabled recruitment, surveillance, and monitoring. Algorithms act as corporate policy, but they remain opaque in most circumstances, and they can change whilst at the same time evoking an air of infallibility. And this makes it impossible for workers to contest unfair or harmful decisions. There have also been calls for the audit of algorithms used in employment, more transparency in their use, and a closer scrutiny of their effects to address discrimination, bias, and other harms. In recruitment, for example, we need to illuminate the full range of automated technologies that are available to different markets. We need to take a closer look at what industries are being targeted by vendors and what functionality the technologies promise and promote. We also need much more awareness of the espoused validity, reliability, and fairness of the technologies in use, and also the experiences of different cohorts of job seekers who navigate AI-enabled recruitment processes that are used either by hiring organisations themselves or who outsource the recruitment process to other providers. And finally, there's a need for increased advocacy. Collective agreements are said to be essential to limit managerial prerogatives, such as the monitoring of workers at both the company and at a sector level. And they can lay down the specific limits of surveillance and provide criteria to improve the transparency of AI-based decision-making processes. And finally, we need to hold employers accountable for the conditions in workplaces. And this is regardless of the system of control that created the conditions. And this is critical to protecting workers and maintaining basic workplace standards. Thank you very much for listening.